our stuff down just a second. Yeah, because what time are we? Because we want to be out by, yeah, perfect.
It's almost 10 after.
Mm-hmm.
You want to wait till 10 after?
No, let's do, Bobby, let her, is she hooked up to her lapel?
Yeah, I think she's ready. Good evening, everyone. Good evening. It is good to see you all. Can you all hear me? Great. So thank you for being here tonight. We're glad that you have joined us. That was a wonderful meal. Where's Sally? Hey, Sally. Sally. I've never had the Reuben casserole before, and I heard that it was extra special, and let me tell you, it was. Yay! Thank you. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. And everybody who helped, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. Yeah, I want the recipe too. We're very glad that you're with us tonight, and I'm very glad that my friend Callie Plunkett Brewton is here. She is the rector at Trinity Florence, and I've known Callie for, we said, is almost 15 years, because before we were both ordained, we worked together at Trinity when I was a youth minister and she was the college minister, and so we've known each other. When I got there, 2008 is when I met her, and so we've known each other for a good long while. But Callie does a great job, and I told her I would not pump her up too much, and I would say Callie is just okay, so that y'all, when y'all hear her how amazing she is, y'all are gonna be like, wow, he really undersold her. No, but Callie is great, and I'm looking forward to hearing her speak, as I know all of you are. And I don't know what else to say, except here is Callie for all of you.
No, I don't need a lectern, because most lecterns, when I'm behind them, I just look like a head on a lectern, or you can see about this much of me. I have the distinction of being the shortest priest in the Diocese of Alabama. It is what it is. So I want to start with a question, because what I like when I speak is for folks to already feel comfortable saying, hey, wait, tell me about this. So I'm warming y'all up by asking you a question. So here's the question. When you've gone through a hard time, or when somebody you know and love has gone through a hard time, have there been some things that people have said to you, well-meaning, wonderful people, have said to you that you thought, wow, that was unhelpful? I'm going to start because, usually it helps. And it's actually, I'm telling a story on my husband, which really in the priest rule book you were totally not supposed to do, but this was a long time ago. My daughter, her name is Mary Margaret, and when she was about 3 years old, she had a nasty reaction to an antibiotic that she was given. And so we raced her to the ER because it was really not pretty, and she was screaming her head off. And she's 16 now, and she can still scream. And my husband, while she's being seen by this nurse, my husband is going, it's okay, you're okay, it's okay. Of course, she was not. And the nurse, who was this wonderful, wise, somewhat sarcastic nurse, she looked at him and she said, no, she's not. It's okay to scream, baby, she said. And I always kind of appreciated that, because that is one thing we tend to say, right? When someone's upset, you go, oh, it's okay. Well, no, it's not. No, it's not. So what are some other things that maybe are not you telling on your spouse or whatever? Worth?
Everything happens for a reason.
Everything
Or
happens.
you're never given more than you can handle.
Yeah.
I hate that.
Yeah.
Or I hate it when you say, my so-and-so has so-and-so, and they go, oh, but my Uncle Joe. Yeah. And immediately change the subject, and it's their ego
Yeah.
bouncing back at you.
Yeah, and sometimes kind of what happens is what they'll do is they'll be like, oh, well, you know, my uncle, he had it real bad. And you're like, is this a competition for suffering?
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
At my mother's funeral, after the 10th person that said to me, I'm so sorry for your loss, and there were 55 other people in line who said the same thing. I was ready to scream at the 12th one.
Yeah.
It was not helpful after the 10th one. It was not.
Yeah.
I wanted something different. Your mom was really a nice person until she got really sick, and then she was really mean. Would have been much more appropriate.
That is fabulous. Now, what was that? You'll get closure?
Get closure, or this will give you closure. And I just hate that. Like, at the death of somebody, or when there's
Really?
a trial, when somebody's, it's like,
Yeah.
Nothing brings you closure at a loss of something
Right.
you love.
Right.
I mean, that's in my opinion. I just can't stand it.
Yeah. Like, yeah, we at some point we'll be able to tie up this life in a bow and you will feel great. Yeah. Yeah. What are some others? Yes. Yes. Which is related to that everything happens for a reason. This is all somehow wrapped up in God's plan.
Pretty artfully concealed, one would say.
Yeah, true. It's a terrible plan, is what you sometimes want to say, right? So that leads me into part 2. And that is that no, I think saying everything happens for a reason and this is all part of God's plan are really crummy things to say. But let me tell you about my friend Victoria. My friend Victoria died in 2019, the end of 2019, in her mid-30s. And when I met Victoria, she was my neighbor, this wonderful, charming young woman in her early 30s who walked the neighborhood with her mischievous imp of a baby, always carrying this baby. Her daughter's name is Mabel. And we would always talk in the neighborhood, and she'd say, I'm thinking of trying your church. And I'd say, hey, anytime. If you want somebody to meet you at the door, if you're not comfortable, whatever, please, we'd love to have you. And she came on Easter Sunday in 2017, she and her family for the first time. And 2 weeks later, my friend Victoria was diagnosed with lung cancer that had metastasized already into her brain. She went to the doctor with headaches, and she actually went to a doctor to test her allergies because she thought it was just allergies, and things kept getting more and more serious. So one day she came to me. That happened in about May of 2017. And that summer, she came to me and she said, I know I only came this one time so far, but she said, I think I really need to talk to a priest. I heard about spiritual directors, and I was thinking in my head, I don't have that degree. But I told her, I said, I'm not trained as a spiritual director, but I said, what I can do is I can walk with you as best as I'm able through this process. And she said, okay. So she came to my office. She sat down on my little blue gingham couch. And she said, all right, let me just tell you the whole thing, which I had known through the grapevine. She said, I have a terminal cancer diagnosis. I don't know how long I have. I said, I know. And she said, but I will tell you this, while I am alive, I will be alive. And I said, okay. And she said, can we meet regularly? And so we did. For the 2 more years, a little bit more than 2 years that she lived, we met just about weekly. There were times where she was a bit sick and was not able to meet with me in person. Sometimes I went over to her house. There at the end, I even attempted to help out with some of the nursing kind of stuff, but she told me, she, by the way, was a nurse before she got sick. She told me I was a terrible nurse. At one point, I was helping her up from that special chair, you know, that she needed to go to the bathroom, and I was helping her up, and I was terrible again. And she looked at me and she said, "Have you already been drinking?" I said, "No, I just don't want to do this. Shut up, Victoria." So, like I said, she'd only been at Trinity one time. Trinity Florence is where I am, of course. She'd only attended Trinity one time before she got sick. And then suddenly she was pretty faithful in her attendance, she and her husband and her little girl. And we as a church surrounded her with love. In fact, I still am thinking about it. I get goosebumps thinking of the way that members of the parish would say, "We need to get some meal teams together. We need to figure out how to help her husband with some things." We had a woman who paid for their house to get cleaned for the entire time that Victoria was sick, and then the year after Victoria died. We had meal teams. They had a cooler that was on the front porch so that we didn't have to bug them. And so we would just put the food in the cooler and text and say, "Hey, the food is here." We had folks who helped walk dogs, babysit, all that good stuff. And people were wonderful. It was funny. I'll tell you the thing that I loved, one of the things I loved the most about my friend Victoria is how incredibly honest she was. So I am not talking about a person who was really, really sick and never complained and just always had her hands folded and all that. No, she complained. There were times she was outright angry and she was honest about it. There were times when people said the absolute wrong things and she would just point that out. In fact, one time she sat down in my office and she said, "Do you know what happens when you're dying?" I said, "No," thinking, I don't know what exactly you're talking about at this point. She said, "Everybody seems to think suddenly, you know, you're sick, you must have time to read all their books. Everybody's given me books on dying now." And I'm thinking, great, as I kind of shoved the book that I'd been thinking of giving her underneath my rear so that she couldn't see it. So I'm telling you this story because when I think about being rooted and grounded in love, which we read about in this text from Ephesians, I think about how that process of walking with my friend Victoria through those 2 years to her death did that. And you know, somebody did say to her at one point, "You know, this is all part of God's plan." Some wonderful, well-meaning person. Because seldom, right, do people say these awful things from a place of ugliness. They just don't know what to say, do they? And so someone said, "I'm sure this is all part of God's plan." And Victoria thought about that for a while, and she came to me in my office. And she said, "You know, I'm thinking maybe this is part of God's plan." Well, before she'd even finished that sentence, I was shaking my head. And she said, "No, stop." She knew me really well by then. She was like, "No, stop. I've thought about this." She said, "I do not believe that God gave me cancer." She said, "But I believe that I am part of God's plan." Yeah, just sit with that. I am part of God's plan. And I believe my life, as short as it might be, is part of a bigger picture, and I can't understand it. But I know that it ultimately has meaning and purpose. I don't believe that my cancer was part of God's plan. I believe I am part of God's plan, she said. And when I look back on my beautiful friend's life, I think if God's ultimate plan is to love and grow us closer to God through love, then Victoria was central to God's plan. Because we learned through those years more about love, giving and receiving, than we had known previously. Victoria's life changed most of ours. And yes, she would snort at hearing this and would say to you right now, she would say, yeah, but I could have used a few more years. So we don't want to romanticize all of this too much. But that gritty, honest, tough process of loving Victoria through cancer and her family rooted and grounded so many of us in love. And it's hard to describe to other people. So I'll let you in on a secret. It's one another thing priests probably shouldn't admit to, and that is that the two hardest sermons for me to write are Christmas Eve and Easter Sunday. And I'll tell you why. It's because people come in who haven't been there throughout the year, and they're all full of the rah-rah and the excitement, and they don't hear the stuff that leads up to them, right? Christmas, we're ready because we've been through Advent. We've spoken about longing. We've talked about the deep, deep ache of the world, right? We have felt it. And when we celebrate the wonder of the incarnation, man, are we ready. Ready to feel that empty place that we have acknowledged in the season of Advent, ready to feel that, what is it they call it, the God-shaped hole. Ready to feel the presence of God in that space. And then on Easter Sunday, everybody comes full of the hallelujah. Right? But we, who have been deprived of that wonderful word through the season of Lent, and have thought about sacrifice and self-sacrifice and have lived in our own ways that final walk of Jesus to the cross, we know that the journey to Easter Sunday is a journey that begins in suffering. And so I have a hard time on Easter Sunday. I have a hard time Christmas Eve for that very reason. And yet at the same time, I'm also really glad to see these people who I haven't seen all year come in, and I know that they need to be fed. So it's a hard responsibility. I don't look at the people who haven't walked through Lent but are here on Easter Sunday with anything but love. I just am having a hard time figuring out how to feed them. So when I read this text from Ephesians, which I'm about to read to you again, it's what's interesting to me about it is that it's one of those very effusive texts, right? It's a very effusive reading. Ephesians is full of that. That's one of the reasons why people will sometimes say, I'm not sure Paul wrote this. He wasn't quite this warm and fuzzy. All right, there are more academic reasons to say that, but it is one of the things people will say. And this is a very effusive part of Ephesians, Ephesians 3, 16 through 19. So I'm going to read it now, and I want you to hear Easter Sunday, okay? I pray that according to the riches of his glory, he may grant that you may be strengthened in your inner being with power through his Spirit, and that Christ may dwell in your hearts through faith as you are being rooted and grounded in love. I pray that you may have the power to comprehend with all the saints what is the breadth and the length and height and depth, and to know the love of Christ that surpasses knowledge, so that you may be filled with all the fullness of God. Is that not an Easter kind of reading? That's incarnation, that's Easter, that is, look at this transformation. Look at the wonder of God. As I said, it's effusive. And I think if you read this without contemplating the fact that whoever this writer was, they were writing to a group of Gentiles, people who up to that point had been cut off from God. You know, it was only through Jesus Christ that Gentiles are allowed to join the family of promise, the family of God. And that's who this writer is writing to. These are Gentiles. And in fact, earlier on in the letter, he says, so then remember, this is in chapter 2, that at one time you Gentiles by birth, called the uncircumcision by those who are called the circumcision. Moving on, remember that you were at that time without Christ, being aliens and strangers to the covenant of promise, having no hope and without God in the world. These are people who know what that other side is like, who know the longing of Advent. And so when this writer is being effusive in this other part in our reading for tonight of Ephesians, it's with an awareness of how powerful and glorious it is when you are in the midst of suffering, when you have felt a stranger and have felt that you are without hope, to have that hand of God touch your life. To have, when you are walking a really dark, hard road, a sense of the wonder and the mystery of the presence of God. A sense, like my friend Victoria, that you, yourself, are part of God's plan. So let me read this again, and I want you to hear my friend Victoria when I read this now. I pray that according to the riches of his glory, he may grant that you, being strengthened in your inner being with power through his Spirit, and that Christ may dwell in your hearts through faith as you are being rooted and grounded in love. I pray that you may have the power to comprehend with all the saints what is the breadth and length and height and depth, and to know the love of Christ that surpasses knowledge, so that you may be filled with all the fullness of God. I was at Victoria's bedside the morning that she died. She was in that state people get right before death, curled up like a baby. And several of us joined hands and encircled her bed and prayed over her. And it was the most sacred moment that I have experienced in my life. Rooted and grounded in love. That's what God did and is continuing to do through the life of Victoria. It's what God can do in each one of us. In us, through us, and thank goodness for us. Quite often being rooted and grounded in love. Well, if you think about that language of being rooted and grounded, that's plant language. And being rooted and grounded means you have to deal with a whole bunch of manure. What's the expression? Manure happens. But with God, love can grow out of that manure. And you can find yourself rooted and connected more deeply to others and to God than you have before. So to return to the question with which I began, let me share with you some wise advice that I got from an Episcopal priest that actually is probably part of the reason that I became an Episcopalian. He said, you know, whenever you are suffering, you should do this one thing. You pray, you ask God, God, what are we going to grow out of this? I'm not a person who loves to get advice, but I think that may be some of the best. What are we going to grow out of this, God? Because we know our God is a creative God, brings new life in old tombs, brings new life in situations that seemed hopeless. I bet if we were here in this room, if we had enough time, I could say, all right, tell me a story of new unexpected life that has grown in your life. I don't know how many people are here, but I bet we could come up with about 1,000 examples of it, couldn't we? Again, I'm not one either for getting or giving a bunch of advice. But I will share the advice of that priest once again. Whenever you find yourself in a place that maybe seems hopeless, where the suffering seems all-encompassing, start praying, God, what are we going to grow out of this manure? And you will be amazed at the results. Amen. Yeah. I think I probably have time for questions or comments, do I? Yeah. Yeah. Anyone have a question? It can be from any number of areas of my life. Or the life of faith, better yet. Yeah. So when the question was, what is a good thing to say to people in difficult times, or, in the dreaded line to the visitation to the family? I'll tell you that probably not saying anything but a hug is the best. I know that, not everybody is a hugger. So, it helps if you can sort of go, are you okay if we, but even just a hand on the shoulder. And just, I tend to find just making eye contact and a hand on the shoulder is the best, or a hug if you know them well. But, I was in a visitation line going to talk to a family. It was a neighbor's family, and they had lost their son in his 20s. And I saw the mother talking intently to all these people, and it was an open casket. And it broke my heart. I thought, I couldn't. I had my boys at that point were really little. And I went up to her. I didn't know her well. And I looked in her eyes, and she just hugged me. I don't even know quite how long we stood there. But that's what I think, quite often the conversation, it's all a blur. If you've been the one that's waiting and receiving people in a receiving line, mostly it's a blur. You're numb, you're tired. And so there's comfort in having these people around you, but quite often if you don't know what to say, I think not being the 700th person, right, to say, I'm sorry for your loss, which is not the worst thing to say. It's just that it does, after a while, you just, each one is another weight upon your back of those, I'm sorry for your loss. So sometimes just a hand on the back, if you know they're a hugger, a hug, I tend to find is the right thing to say. I did hear someone say once, I pray that you will feel the love of God surrounding you in the days to come. And I thought that was beautiful. And it was followed up after that and by the way, if you need a casserole or something, I'm on it. So the fact of the matter is, even sometimes something that's kind of humorous, not crazy humorous, but, we are known for just really burying people in casseroles when they're dealing with loss, but sometimes something just kind and warm is a good thing. Yeah. But as I said, I really loved hearing this person say, I pray that you feel the love of God surrounding you in the days to come. I was like, no, I'm going to file that away. Yeah. 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 Now, if they're not a person of faith, the thing to say is, I hope that you feel all of us loving on you as best as we are able, Yeah.
Where did you go to seminary?
So, you thought it was a simple question, didn't you? Here you go. So I went to seminary as a person from a different denomination. I was raised in Churches of Christ. Yes, those Churches of Christ. I'm the great-grand and daughter. So my great-grandfather, my grandfather, and my father are all Church of Christ preachers. Yeah. Yeah. So, well, thank you. I'm so glad to be here. So my father has a PhD in Old Testament studies. And when I was in college, I was an undeclared major for 2 years. And finally, at some point, thought, well, I love the Old Testament. I want a PhD in Old Testament. And so I went to seminary not planning on ordination. I wanted to go to a seminary that would help me get into a good PhD program in Old Testament. So I went to Princeton Theological Seminary, which is Presbyterian, and did what I set out to do. In fact, when Worth and I met, I was feverishly working to finish my dissertation. And so got that degree and then did the ordination track. But the Commission on Ministry let me get creative. They did not require me to go and do a year of Anglican studies, which is usually what they would require someone to do. Or we're much more flexible now, actually, with some of those things. But so I did not go up to Sewanee and do that because I have a husband who's an English professor. He's now a dean of the honors college at UNA. And so he said, I'm not packing up so you can go do school for a year. I think surely they can figure out another way to educate you. So what I did is I had the great privilege of going up to Sewanee once a month to meet with a retired professor who would load me down with books about all things Anglican. And I would go home and I would devour these books as best I could, go back up, return the books. He and I would sit and talk for hours. He'd load me up with more. And I did this for about 6-7 months until I was pregnant with my third child, until I got to that point where the doctor said, please stop traveling. And so that's my long seminary story. But yeah, that's what I did. Yep. And the professor, should any of you know, was a New Testament professor from England. I think he's moved back to the UK, actually. His name's Christopher Bryan, and he was delightful. And so as an Old Testament scholar, sitting down and talking about all things Anglican with the New Testament scholar, we spoke the same language. So I had some major questions about things like, infant baptism, coming from my tradition of the Churches of Christ. And we got to talk Bible about it. So it was great. Yeah. I have a completed and approved dissertation, yeah, that I actually went back to a few weeks ago because there was an Isaiah text. I thought, man, I'm pretty sure I wrote on this. I did. Yep. And my work was in biblical Hebrew poetry. And so I focused primarily on chapters 40 to 55 of Isaiah. Yeah. Some of the best poetry in the Bible. Yep.
The Psalms are not all in the book of Psalms.
That's right. Yep. And of course in 2nd Isaiah, that writer quotes, that's what we call those chapters of Isaiah, that writer quotes the Psalms all over the place. So, yep. Sue.
You've shown a response that my mother-in-law gave to the 40th person that said, I'm so sorry for your loss. She looked up and said, well, I didn't think you'd live forever. I didn't think you'd live forever.
Awesome.
It's not advice.
I rather like that though. Yeah.
Considering my mother was in outside Chicago, Illinois, at Church of the Holy Spirit, which is one of the wealthiest parishes in the United States, and some of the people coming through the line, shaking my hand, were members of that church who are good friends of my sister and her family, who are like the executives for major corporations in the United States. I don't think that was an appropriate response. I think I might have cut back church giving a while.
I don't know.
Thank you.
Yeah. But one of the pieces of advice, not real advice, but when we're taught pastoral care, quite often what will they say? They'll say, don't give them meaning. Don't tell people, well, this is for this or this. Don't even attempt that. Your purpose in this moment is not to find an answer, but to make a connection. And that really, so whatever you come up with to say, it's not about what you say. And that's why I say, to touch, even just to say, I loved this person, if you did, Now, if you didn't, maybe don't say that. But it's all about making a connection. So when I was in seminary, we had to do CPE, clinical pastoral education. And my CPE was at a psychiatric hospital. So I was in Churches of Christ, and really what I did is I was just avoiding having to do a year-long placement at a church because I didn't really know what folks in Churches of Christ were going to find for me to do at a church, which I did discover that summer, and it was children's ministry, which was fine. But I did that year working with the mentally ill, and my very first day, I had this patient come up and start arguing with me about a section from the letter of Paul to the Romans. And, yeah. And I was like, oh. And so I argued back with him. He was like, don't you think Paul means this and this? And I said, no, I don't think he does at all. So we had this conversation, and then we had these times when we would meet with our chaplain that was in charge of us, and we had to report back. And so I told him, well, listen, and I can't remember what the guy, Michael was the patient. I said, well, Michael and I talked about this, and Dwight was my supervisor, and he said, you managed to give this man no pastoral care in that moment. And I was like, it was a shaky start at the psych hospital for Callie. But, after a while, what I learned was that what I had was a ministry of presence. I wasn't there to give answers. I was there to be present, to make a connection with these people who felt isolated, vulnerable, shut off from the rest of the world, because they were.
You're probably delighted to have a wonderful conversation with somebody giving a back and forth.
No, maybe.
I mean, you were treating him like
Yeah.
you treat a normal parishioner now if they were having a
Yeah.
discussion about that section of the Bible. You were treating many different, and that
Yeah.
might have been a real relief for him not to be treated like a schizophrenic or whatever his diagnosis.
What was his diagnosis? Yeah.
He might have been talking out of his head, but you were treating him like an
Yeah.
actual functioning regular human being out
Yeah.
in the regular world.
Well, thank you. That makes me feel better. It's been years, but, but one of the things I did learn, I had a wonderful patient who was a Jewish man, and what we would do, because he learned from me that I knew Hebrew, and we would go to sort of one of these little side rooms, and I'd bring my Hebrew Bible, and we would read the Psalms together. And that was a ministry of presence. It was a ministry of connection. And I did get to know, because I still remember his name, I did get to know Michael, who argued the Bible with me. And I did do a better job in the future, where I didn't just argue back, but I asked him more questions. So tell me what this is about. Like, why are you, what's in this verse that has gotten you so stirred up? And we would talk, but it's true. One of the things about making a connection is not talking down and making somebody feel like, oh, I'm being studied like some sort of specimen. So that's true. Yeah, I had not horrifically bad instincts at the beginning. Yeah. But yeah, I think it's all about connection, which is really what, like I said, that's what I see in that Ephesians passage, about being rooted and grounded in love. It's all about connecting.
Callie, you've been absolutely.
Oh, well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you all. Yeah.